Welcome to this Photoshop introduction class. My name is Emmanuel. I'm going to be teaching you for the next couple of days. Photoshop. Wait, just take a seat. So when we open up Photoshop, we're greeted by the home page. On the top left, there should be a blue button that says New File or Create New or Make New, something along those lines. Let's click on that. And this opens up the new document window. It looks very similar to other Adobe programs. But along the top, we've got some tabs, things like photo, print, art and illustration, etc. As we click through these tabs, the blank document presets underneath change. So, for example, if I go on print, you'll see that we have presets for A6, A5, A3. If I go onto mobile, because I'm making something that will be only on a mobile, you'll see that I have presets for iPhones and Androids and Apple Watches and that sort of stuff. If we go to print and then choose A4, you'll notice that the values on the right-hand side change to match A4. So the width and the height turn to 210 and 297. I don't have to use a preset. I can put in my own values if I want. So if I wanted to work on, for example, a square piece of paper, I could put in 210 by 210, but we'll stick with A4. To the right of where we see the width, we've got a drop-down menu that says millimeters, which just affects the units of measurement for the size of our document. We've got inches, centimeters, millimeters. We've also got pixels. So like I said, our screen is made up of pixels, lots of tiny little dots that make up the images that we see. If we just change the units of measurement to pixels for a second, you'll see that an A4 piece of paper is equal to 2480 by 3508 pixels. You don't have to remember that, but it is going to be useful if you have a general idea of how big a pixel image is in relation to a real piece of paper. If you want to be working with print and sending things off and getting them back in good quality, they need to be large enough in terms of their pixel size. So if I was going to go to Google Images and find an image that was 500 pixels by 500 pixels and try to print that out, it'll either be really small or I can blow it up so it looks really bad. So yeah, you don't have to remember how many pixels an A4 sheet of paper is, but as you start to use Photoshop more, you should start keeping in mind the pixel sizes of things to make sure that things do look all right. And I'll make a note to talk about how we find a suitable image for print or projects, etc. Anyways, we have the orientation of our page, portrait or landscape. Our screen's a landscape, so let's work with a landscape orientation. Underneath that, we've got resolution. Resolution is essentially a way of telling Photoshop how big this virtual piece of paper is in terms of a real piece of paper. It's measured in pixels per inch. So at a resolution of 300 pixels per inch, it means that for every inch on our screen, there are 300 pixels packed in. And all you need to know that at 300 pixels per inch, a virtual piece of paper is equal to a real piece of paper. Sometimes you'll see stuff that's at 150 or 72 pixels per inch. If you try to print those things out, they won't look great. So all you need to know is keep things at 300 pixels per inch if you want to print it. If you don't think you're going to print it, work at 300 pixels per inch anyways, because it's nice to have the opportunity to do. You've also got color mode underneath. So we've got a few options here. We've got grayscale. This means that your image will be completely in black and white and shades of gray. So if you're trying to select colors and they're not turning out as colors, you might be in grayscale. We also have RGB color, which stands for red, green, and blue. All the pixels on our screen emit varying amounts of red, green, and blue light, and the varying amounts of red, green, and blue make up the full color spectrum that we can see on our screen. But then we've also got CMYK color, which stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black or key, which simulates the colors that we get with printer inks. If you work with CMYK color, then the spectrum of colors that you'll be able to see on your screen within Photoshop will be more limited because regular printer inks can't produce things like neon pinks or fluorescent greens or that sort of thing, or deep blues. So putting it on CMYK color limits the amount of colors that you can use, but it gives you a slightly better impression of what this will look like when it comes to print. But it's also important to note that when you set it to CMYK color, you're getting an RGB representation of CMYK because all of our screens present in RGB. You're also getting your screen's RGB interpretation of CMYK. Inevitably, there will be different sort of differences in what you end up with. The only way to figure that out is to do a test print or pay lots and lots of money for a really color accurate monitor. Let's just stick to RGB. So we're going to make an A4 sheet of paper. It's going to be landscape, 300 pixels per inch, set to RGB. Let's hit create. I want to make sure that we're all working with the same interface. So before we do anything, I'm just going to get you all to reset the interface so that we're all working from the same thing. And we're going to do this by going to Window at the top, Workspace, and then Reset Essentials. So here's the interface. We've got our sheet of A4 paper in the middle. On the left, we've got our toolbar. As I select different tools on the toolbar, the control bar at the top will change, and this will just allow me to change the way that some of these tools function. On the right-hand side, we've got various panels, which will also allow us to either access certain options more easily or again, tweak the way that certain things behave. Photoshop is a layer-based program. Everything that we draw in Photoshop exists on a layer, and this allows us to have maximum amount of control and editability over the things that we create. So on the bottom right, we should have a layers panel. And right now we have one layer. It's called the background layer. We have a little thumbnail that sort of represents what we have on it. In order to make a new layer, we need to click on the little plus on the bottom right of that window. So let's all do that and create a new layer. And you'll see that we get a layer 1. So the background layer that we had was filled with white, and the layer 1 that we just made has this checkerboard pattern on it. Even though we perceive this white background layer as having nothing on it, Photoshop sees that white and it thinks that's stuff. So there is stuff on the background layer. It's just white stuff. If you see this checkerboard pattern, that means that there's nothing there. It's transparent. So just so that you're aware of what that means, this layer 1 actually has nothing on it, whereas the background layer does have stuff on it. But I'm just going to go through some of the tools that we're going to use within Photoshop, and we'll start with the brush tool. So on the toolbar, about a third of the way down, there is a paintbrush. This allows us to make brush marks on our layer. Make sure that you're working on layer 1. So if I just click and drag, I'll make some brush marks. I can change the type of brush that I'm using up on the control bar. You'll see that there's a little representation of the brush that I have. There's all sorts of brushes that we have within different folders. And we've got hard round brushes, soft round brushes, dry media brushes, etc. If I use the square brackets on my keyboard, I can increase or decrease the size of my brush. I can change the color of my brush with the color picker at the bottom of the toolbar. So at the bottom of the toolbar, there's 2 boxes to set the foreground and the background color. If I click on that top one, the foreground color, then I open up the color picker and I've got a thin strip and a big square. That thin strip changes the hue. So you'll see that cycles through colors. And the big square is where I adjust the brightness and the saturation. So top right is very bright and saturated. Bottom left is dark and desaturated. We also have an eraser tool. That's a few tools down from the brush tool. So about halfway down, it's a black and white rectangle sort of at an angle. And this allows us to erase things. It's important to use the eraser tool if you want to get rid of something and not just brush in over white, because otherwise you're brushing in white stuff rather than getting rid of the stuff that you're trying to erase. That's the brush tool and the eraser tool. Let's go to the move tool. So the move tool is the first tool on the toolbar. It's the one with the 4 arrows going in different directions. And this will allow you to move a layer. So if I use the move tool, you'll notice that everything on that layer moves. Photoshop doesn't discriminate between brush marks that have been made within the same layer. It just sees an entire layer and it just moves that. If I want to move something specific within that layer, then I need to use a selection tool to select that first and then use the move tool. The second tool on the toolbar is the selection marquees. Mine looks like an ellipse, but yours might look like a rectangle. I'm going to click and hold so that I can pull up this menu and change it to the rectangle. And then if I want to make a selection around something, let's say that I want to move this strip of pink marks, I'm going to click and drag to draw a selection around it. And I'm not going to be able to move those marks if I still have the selection tool active. You'll notice that I just moved my selection box. I'll need to go back to the move tool and then move it. So the selection tool itself can't do any movements. I've got to select something with a selection tool and then use the move tool itself to actually move that thing around. So I can use that to move things. I don't have to move entire shapes or brush marks. I could be quite creative and maybe split things up by making a selection of part of a circle or part of a brush mark. So, but if you've got a selection active, not only does that allow you to select and move things around, it will also restrain the area within which you can work in. Before we go back to the brush tool, let's all just make a rectangular selection somewhere with nothing in it.
Mine's not letting me do that.
So if we make a rectangular selection somewhere, and let's also make another layer. So click the new layer button and we'll have a layer 2. Let's also change color so that we have a different color for our layer 2 as well. When we have a selection active, not only can we use that to move things around, but we can also use that to restrain the area within which we work. So if I try and use the brush tool outside of my selection, nothing happens. But if I try and use it within, you'll see that I'm locked into only drawing within that specific area. If I want to deselect something, I can do it with Control D or Command D on a Mac. That will just get rid of the current selection that I have active. If at any point you're using the brush tool and you're finding that you can't make any marks or it's not doing anything, you might have a really small selection active somewhere that you haven't noticed. So just press Control D and you should be able to then start drawing again. If you hold down Shift while drawing a selection with a rectangular marquee tool, you'll be locked into drawing a square selection. So if you want to make a square shape rather than a rectangle shape, then you can hold down Shift. And this will be a common thread within Photoshop that holding down Shift will restrict you in some way to allow you to be more precise. Let's make another layer so that we have a layer 3. And let's also change color again. So that was a rectangular marquee. Let's have a look at the elliptical marquee, which allows you to make circular selections. So I'll click and hold on the rectangular marquee to bring up the elliptical marquee. And this will allow me to make elliptical selections. Pretty self-explanatory. If I hold down Shift while making an elliptical selection, I'll be locked into a perfect circle. Let's make another layer and let's change color again. And let's move on to the lasso selection tools. So next tool under are the lasso selections. So if I click and hold, there should be a lasso tool. And the lasso tool allows me to make custom selections that I draw myself. So if I just draw a shape, then I can make a selection based on that. I can have multiple selections up if I hold down the Shift key and draw another one. So I've got one selection up here. If I hold down Shift, you'll notice that I get a little plus sign next to my cursor. And this means that I can select something else or add to a selection or do another selection completely elsewhere. If I hold down the Alt key or Option on a Mac, then I get a little subtract sign next to my cursor, which means that I can subtract from a selection to modify it. And this is the same for all selection tools. So the rectangular marquee tool, the elliptical marquee tool, all of them. Shift and Alt or Option on a Mac to add or subtract from your selections. That's the lasso tool. Let's make another layer and let's change colors again. And let's go to the polygonal lasso tool. So if I click and hold on the lasso tool, then the second tool on that menu is the polygonal lasso. And if I click once anywhere with the polygonal lasso, I'll make a point and you'll notice that a line protrudes from my mouse. The polygonal lasso tool allows me to make custom selections as well, but it allows me to draw them point to point. So I can click again to make a point and then keep on clicking to make hard cornered or hard edged selections, which again behave just like any other selection. If I don't want to have to use the brush tool to fill in a selection, I can press Alt and Delete on my keyboard, and that will fill a selection. And that's Option and Backspace on a Mac. But Alt and Delete will fill any selection without having to brush it in myself. The way that I choose to remember that is that if you're not going to delete something, the alternative to that would be filling it. So Alt, Delete. If while you're drawing a selection with a polygonal lasso tool, you don't want to have to return all the way to the starting point to close the selection, you can double click anywhere and it will automatically close that selection, which is just useful if you don't want to have to, if you know that there's just going to be a straight line from this point to the end point, I can just double click and it will close that selection. If I'm in the process of drawing a selection and I want to get rid of the selection, I want to stop making this selection, I can press the escape key and I'll stop drawing that selection. And that's something that freaks people out if they don't know how to get off from there. Just press the escape key.